Danny, I'm really curious as a therapist to sort of adjunct to the work you do in the movement space. What kind of therapist or therapy do you feel like is sort of best suited to work alongside the work you
Man, that's a new question. Yeah, so I'm a poor generalist, right? I've been exposed to a lot of different treatments and a lot of different protocols and practices. A lot of that being attributed to the time at VHP in Virginia Beach. And I'll start by saying this. I was very dismissive to a lot of the modalities and a lot of the therapeutic stuff until I experienced it for myself, like most of us. But I actually had a situation where I did a sacrocranial massage session. And I went into it thinking it was going to be the most ridiculous waste of time. This woman standing at the top of the stairs, no shoes, hair down to her knees. Well, that was your journey. Absolutely incredible. Ended up signing up for 10 sessions after. And it was a very weird, different application, but I felt what I felt, and it became very legitimate to me in the moment. So from things like that, and some of the more esoteric things and some of the things that are a little bit more nuanced to things that are much more conventionally practiced, from chiropractic to deep tissue massage to nutrition being a big one. The fascial system is integrated or can be tied to any single little subset that we try to pick and pull on. So from my mind, you probably eat tremendously better than I do, but I might do more mobility work than you do. So for our tissue quality, we would need two different types of inputs to see measurable or distinct change. So from a general perspective, I think that the supporting elements in the therapeutic modalities and different applications all have some value and some application, but depending on who the person is, what the constituent parts are, and what the objectives are, it will fluctuate what those treatments and what those modalities may include. But it goes back to that central point of the way that we can trace and tie the fascial system to so many different things. Almost anything can be made to have an argument for being beneficial, and I think that it's usually worth giving things a shot more often than being dismissive to them.
So what I'm hearing basically is that, say if I started to work with you and I was doing a lot more of this work that was fascially driven, I guess, as far as the way that you approach movement and the systems you have, I shouldn't be throwing out my chiropractor or my soft tissue therapist or my therapist or osteo. Like, if it works for you, it works for you, and whether you're doing your style training or not, it doesn't really,
100%. And like, here's a really easy example of that too. Deep tissue work, deep tissue massage. Who needs deep tissue massage? Well, everybody, right? Everyone needs it to a degree. But we look at that as being something that is only sought out for when we're sore, when we're exhausted, when we have an injury. So we think, okay, I just had knee surgery, I should probably go get some tissue work around the knee. So we're very reactive in that regard. But I think that if we look at those as being essentially like support elements to performance, and again, whether you're general population or an elite athlete, budget, cost, accessibility not included here, I think that those things are all extremely beneficial and things that should be done proactively as opposed to reactively. It's something I've kind of ascribed to, is that recovery and restoration, when it's done reactively, isn't recovery or restoration.
Yeah. Speaking of recovery, what kind of, is there a different timeline to sort of the response? Like, a two-part question. The athletes that you've worked with, and you're really good at asking questions, I feel, and when you work with your athletes and they give you feedback, what are they kind of feeling? And maybe it's, as opposed to a traditional lifting session compared to what you might do with them, what are they feeling? And is there any difference in timeline for recovery, or what they can expect, or even what they can and can't do that day or the next day?
So for the user input, they probably think that I'm full of crap early on. This guy's just making things up to be entertaining. But we've touched on it a couple of different times throughout these video modules. But the one thing that I do take serious pride in, I really do, it does mean a lot to me that they feel better. Whether it's a tight hamstring, whether it's an operated shoulder, they feel better. So I think that the important part of that is that feeling better creates the psychological environment to actually get better. And with our world and our industry specifically becoming so heavily driven by tech, data, biotech and wearables, all those things are fantastic. But if we lose the human element of what we do, then our job no longer really has much value or meaning in my mind, right? So the feel is a big one. Sensation of pain coming down, pretty consistently with that. And I think intriguing and interesting and fun and engaging, would kind of be the third most common points of feedback that I get. And again, that kind of ties back to that initial point of like, yes, we need to objectively improve things. I'm well aware of that. But at the same time, if I can get people even fractionally more excited or incentivized to train and doing good quality things, I think that's a massive win. And it kind of forms that environment to develop a good platform to build from. To the second part, the timeline is interesting, and it was really interesting the way you worded that, because I do think that there is a little bit more of a learning curve to this. Not because it's anything other than a little bit different, but when people come into a gym, they come in with a very clear expectation or connotation as to what they're getting ready to undertake. For an example, for me, it would be if I go into a financial manager, I have a very clear vision of what I think that would be like. I don't know anything about money. So I can create whatever, envision that I have. But when you come in expecting something and then it's totally different, that, gives you a little bit longer learning curve, but does come with excitement and interest. So I think the timeline early on is the movement literacy period, which is something that I do really ascribe to, where I want to teach and show and allow them to feel things that we're going to eventually be loading or we're eventually going to be, doing with frequency throughout the programming. And then once we kind of get that initial literacy phase out of the way, things start to move pretty quickly. And once they feel some of these certain angles or these different combination patterns, a couple of times, then we can start to kind of pick up and go. Now, in terms of the physical responses to things, I don't believe that there is quite the same level of strain demand as we would see if we compared it to something polar opposite like a 531. So I think that, it allows athletes, and this is probably even more especially true for Gen Pop, to create a continuum of training, because they don't feel like they have this, exhaustive recovery getting back to baseline. Now, if we're talking about the elite athletes, this is probably a little bit of a different conversation, but for most, again, because we're not pushing so hard on the compounding volume, because it's not very much compressive load, if any at all, and because we are always essentially microdosing, right? It's always total body with some little element of focus. It kind of blends that stress out evenly enough to where we can kind of go back to back and we can do moderate to high intensity loading with appropriate volume and not having, the delayed, soreness and stiffness. Yeah.
I mean, speaking about adaptation, as a therapist, and I would say that I've been engaged in fascia for a long time, probably, almost definitely not at the same level that you've read. I know that I've read, and a lot of people talk about the slowness of fascia adapting, and that it adapts slower than muscle does. Is that a consideration with the work you do, or is it only in that kind of purely structural, almost postural sort of sense?
I think it's really important to bifurcate that into two different points, because I attached to that thinking early on as well, because we read 1 to 2 years for fascial remodeling and things like that, and it's a slower collagen turnover and all the physiological properties that come with it, but the sensory adaptation occurs quickly. And if we keep this on the track of the fascial sensory motor properties, I think a lot of it goes to interoception and kinesthesia. So interoception meaning my body's awareness of where my body is, how I feel about how I feel. And again, kind of going back to that literacy component where, we're teaching things that people have done, but we're doing it in just a little bit of a different way, or we're, looking at a specific angle or position. there's a coordination process that we got to get through, and that's this interoceptive and proprioceptive aptitude. So I think this sensory piece happens pretty quickly, and I don't want to speak too much on this because I don't, it's not my scope or ability to do so, but I think that there's a similar response or aptitude with the nociceptive response as well.
Sure.
Especially when we have things like non-specific low back pain. If somebody's coming off of an ACL tear, that's a different situation.
Sure.
But somebody who's just chronically tight hamstrings, chronically, tight low back, I think we can get those things cleaned up pretty quickly. Now, for the adaptations on the more physical side and the remodeling and the collagen turnover and remodeling as well, that is a longer process that over time, we're competing against multiple variables. So, if we're thinking about like specifically, adaptation specific to like the fascial lines, right? How long did they spend doing compound bilateral structural loading? Where are they within their playing or their sport career? Those things are going to be considerable factors. If I have a 14-year-old kid, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be a 1 to 2 year process. If I have a 38-year-old man, retired athlete, it's probably going to be a little bit of a longer window. But there's absolutely ability to make transient and short-term change. I think that the tissue viscosity is another one that we can make acute changes on pretty quickly. The tissue elasticity and the stiffness properties, those are the aspects that are probably going to be several months, if not a year plus. Yeah.
So if I'm not getting sore from the training, and if if there's that feeling of feeling better almost immediately afterwards, rather than getting driven down and just completely wiped out after a session, should I be doing it more often? Like, do you give you guys homework to sort of reinforce a lot of the stuff you're doing with them in person, one-on-one?
Conceptually, yes. Yeah. I think like to kind of touch on that first part, I think that that's another serious misconstruction, especially from the athlete perspective, that if I'm not broken down, if I'm not exhausted, if I don't, if I can't get up off of the toilet without assistance, then I didn't do a good workout. Unequivocally untrue. Unequivocally untrue, especially when we're talking about elite athletes. If me and you were tasked to pack up everything in this house and put it into a moving truck, I'd wake up tomorrow with my chest hurting because of the lung capacity that I don't have, and I'd be sore in places that I didn't know existed. Soreness is just indication of doing something or exposing your body to something that it's not accustomed to. That's it, right? So if we experience soreness in training, whether we're talking on the fascial side or we're talking on the conventional side, that's all that it is. It's just exposure to volume, intensity, or movement that we haven't done. So because the essence of fascial-based training is more, emphasized on motor patterning, the coordination of movement, seaming different movements together, being able to move in different velocities and planes, I think that there just isn't enough of the redundancy that we see in a conventional model that produces that same, sensation, so to speak. So that's really where we start to get into like what is the situation that we're handling right now. And if we stick to just kind of like a general sense here, I think that I try to train 3 or 4 days a week, and I try to exercise every day. And so with the fascial-based concepts, it becomes very easy to do that, right? So basically 3 or 4 days we're going to load and work and push and really try to reach those points of fatigue. And then the other 2 or 3 days, I want to feel good. Like, I'm 33 now, so even though I'm the youngest one of this bunch, I'm starting to get some of those,
What kind of low blow was that, by the way?
Hey, I'm quick, man.
I'm the one hobbling around.
But I want to go in and I want to do something that makes me feel good, feel better, not take an hour and a half, and then get a little bit of a light sweat and keep pushing.
All right, feeling good, feeling better. What have been the responses with your guys? Whether there's data or not, and tell me if there is, because I'd love to know if there is data on this, on like injury incidents, and how often someone gets hurt, or maybe if you work with sort of small groups, how likely sort of injuries that might have previously been with them or in their group or in their sport yeah, is there anything you've found yourself, or even sort of read in this space?
So having injury occur during training, or
even during sport. So like, let's say you take on an athlete, and in the first year they're like, oh, actually my ankles aren't getting as sore, something as small as that, or hamstring occurrences are reduced in sprinters, etc.
So we're going to sit down here again a year from now, and I will thoroughly answer that question. Unfortunately, with the work situation that I've had here recently, no, I can't honestly answer that very well.
Yeah.
But with that, I have a very strong belief that we can influence that to a degree, and it goes right back to balancing the type of stress and the type of tissues that we're stressing. This connective tissue versus contractile capacity, and I'll use college football for this because it's the easiest example for sure. Brute force, power, volume, a ridiculous amount of frequency. 2 days throughout an entire off season, in the heat, in the cold, they're exposed to a lot. But the vast majority of the general university setting for football is bench squat dead clean, 110s, and high volume short interval running. Most universities ascribe to that model. So where I come into play, and I had a couple of athletes this year, that this was the case for. There's certain time points throughout that season where I wouldn't hear from anybody for anything, and then it would shoot up. Tons of people reaching out. End of training camp, right? First 2 weeks of the season. Last few weeks of the season. Coming off of a bye week. So we know that the number one factor that drives injuries is rapid changes in volume or intensity, right? Tissues are loaded faster than they're able to respond. We have an extended period, something like a bye week. We have an extended period where we're not doing what we're normally doing, and then boom, we try to ramp right back up, and Achilles goes, hamstring goes. So, getting back to my point, I look at what they're doing and then fill where I can provide on that. And in every single case thus far, it's been, okay, we need more connective tissue action. So I had a case this past year where I had an athlete come to me with posterior tibialis tendonitis, which was not one you hear about all the time. And I was told that he was on a 6 to 8 week return to play timeline, and my goal was to help facilitate a shorter time, right? And we ended up getting him back in 2 weeks, and it was actually a really cool moment because we were at that game, and he scored a long touchdown, 60-yard touchdown, just before halftime, and went into the end zone right in front of us. So it was a really cool moment. But we didn't really do that much. We really didn't do that much. We had some manual work along the posterior tib, some gastroc work, worked on the arches a little bit, and then we just kind of did low-grade isometrics. We did some different, ankle and wall concepts, and then I just kind of had him start to move in different parameters. The interesting part of that, and I didn't find this out until after the fact, was this was an individual who had transferred from another school, as everyone is now, and at his previous school, played wide receiver, and he was interchangeable. So line up on the right, line up on the left, inside, outside, and then when he got to this school, he exclusively only lined up on one side. And so all of his routes were breaking the same way and moving in the same direction, and it ended up flaring up that posterior tibialis. So it's just a good illustration of kind of some of these points coming together where chronic overload is going to eventually create breakdown. I will die on that hill. I know there's a lot of people that are, have a different opinion on that, but if you just think about it in the most simplistic way, if you do the same thing over and over again, eventually there's going to be a breaking point. So if we deviate from what those typical loading patterns are, and we allow the body to, distribute stress a little bit more evenly or throughout different tissues, I think we allow the opportunity to then put the right inputs down and allow them to be able to utilize and fluctuate between both.
So knowing that you're here with a bunch of track athletes, we turn left. Always. So without the option of turning the track around and starting to run clockwise, are we talking about maybe doing? I know of some race walkers that I've worked with before that call it sort of unwinding at the end of a session, where they'll start going the other way around the track.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's extra stress to the body that's not specific to the sport? Like, do you think that sort of environment might
Intuitively, yes.
Intuitively,
I think the same thing about backwards walking and running.
Mm.
Right? I think that's like one of the best things that most people can do in any capacity, because we only walk in one direction, and it's the same stress patterns on the same sets of tissues. I was very, very curious about that. That was like, because last summer I kind of got introduced to working with the track world, which is fantastic. But I expected to see more like clear, okay, they only turn left, there's going to be this like systemic pattern that we'll start to notice, and I haven't. You know, I think, you know, there are certain little things, little subtleties where, you know, like the right medial plantar arch will sit more flush on the ground because of that eversion pronation. And I think that, you know, I would have thought that there would be more discrepancies between hamstring groups. Can't find anything on that. So I think that that's something that I would say was a surprise to me. But in track and field, again, in my novice experience with them, there's a really unique way of stress breakdown presenting itself. You would think that because there's so much linearity to the sport and such a lack of variability, that it would be more consistent, and nothing that I can find.
Yeah, really interesting. Yesterday you were telling me how you got some force plates coming. Tell me about what you're looking at.
I feel like a big boy now. I feel like I can speak with a little more bass in my voice. Super excited, man. You know, shout out to Drake and Hawken Dynamics and Simply Faster for helping arrange that for me. I am most interested in time to stabilize, obviously discrepancies, and I'm very interested to see what manual inputs do. You know, we've got more than abundance of studies on PAP and contrast and, you know, different types of jump protocols and how does it influence jump measures. I'll leave that to the true experts. I'm curious to know if a 15-minute, you know, lower leg myofascial massage or modulation influences jump parameters, and I'm curious to know if it what it does in a transient and an acute sense, and then if there is any, you know, pattern or correlation to the adaptation more long term. The time to stabilize for me is very fascinating because within all of the different connective tissue structures, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to trace any of the thousands of metrics that these force plates are producing and not point back to the musculotendinous junction or the tendinous tissue. But time to stabilization is a little bit unique in that regard because it's the coordination of multiple segments being able to work succinctly and synergistically. So beyond a very big, you know, theory or you know, perspective interest here, I don't know that there's any legitimacy to that, but I do intuitively feel like there may be something to that. And standardization, I know we do very tough as well, but
Yeah, of course.
you know, again, conceptually, I think that's going to be cool.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that you're working on as well, is standardizing your approach and
Very much so,
and
yeah.
saying, you know, this is a repeatable few things that you can potentially do to
Yeah.
add some complexity to this movement, but standardize and stabilize it. Working with Stu, I know that you've read a lot of Stu's work, and he for a long time he's been talking about different styles of athletes and different kind of movement profiles. Do you think that there are certain types of athletes with certain sort of physical attributes, fascial attributes, whether they're, you know, more of those speed, more powerful athletes that are coming from spending time on the ground, the more fascial athletes in the air? Like, are you finding that one's better than the other, or responds better or worse to your training, or have you found anything in that space with the athletes you've worked with so far?
Whew, loaded. So great opportunity to promote my new product coming out here in about a month or so. Fascial Mechanics, you can find it on ruderockstrength.com. No, kidding aside, that is actually kind of the centerpiece to this project. So the mechanics of fascia for sport was really derived by my partner, Matt Aldred, who works with Furman University basketball team. And his begging question was, are there fascial-based movers and are there muscle-based movers? And the easiest example, sticking with basketball, is looking at, for instance, Ja Morant versus Jokic. Those two guys play the same sport. Ja, 6'2", 6'3", 175 pounds. Jokic, 7 feet, 270 pounds. One, blazing lightning fast. The other, I don't know if he ever even makes it all the way up and down the court. Totally different behaviors, totally different anthropometrics, everything. So this is one of those things where I think intuitively all of us have understood that, yes, there are different strategies and there are different archetypes for movement or for movers within any sport. It's the same for track, it's the same for football. I think the problem that we've had is being able to clearly define that and then organize it. So absolutely nothing original here, but we went off of a quadrant system that many others have produced. But essentially looking at it is high force, high velocity. Where do these athletes fall? So how I've organized this or thought about it, Matt and I rather, in your top right, so high velocity, high force, we have our outliers. LeBron James. Guy does everything, uses everything, he's fast, he's strong, he's hard to move, he's able to move people. On the opposing end, bottom left, low force, low velocity, we have the hybrids, right? Not great at anything, but can kind of do everything, kind of in the mix, but find a way. On the bottom right, high force, low velocity, that's our Jokic. That's our big guys, our people who can move people, but can't really move very well themselves. They use a totally different strategy. And then finally in the top left, high velocity, low force, Ja Morant. Those are the twitchy, the quick, elastic guys. So yes, I do think that there's significance to that. I think that, hopefully with this product and then with what other people are doing as well with force profiling and through data, we'll be able to kind of paint a better picture of that. Depending on your level of standard, that can be difficult to reach, but conceptually, yes. Now, the important part of that, and this was a mistake that I made for a very long time, is we never want to make strength a weakness. So, and a lot of coaches go through this phase, right? We're so gung-ho about what can we do, what can we provide, what can we help, and so we just pick people apart. Oh, well, your internal rotation on your left hip is, and we microanalyze these things, and we forget about keeping the strength strong. So I think that's foremost. We don't want to take Ja Morant and say, hey man, we got to put 20 pounds on you this offseason, you don't have enough muscle mass. And equally, we don't want to take Jokic and say, hey man, if you're not twitching next year, we might have some problems. How do they perform in their sport relative to their level or their competition? What makes them great at what they do? And then where do we see potential deficit or limitation? So it's really about trying to find the blend or balance between these two, systems of being fascial based or being more muscularly driven, and then seeing how they respond to it, and most importantly, how does it influence play? Because what we do in the facility is supportive. It's a supportive role to the sport. So that has to be the ultimate qualifier. How do they perform in sport? And I think with all of these things, being equal, so to speak, we can probably say that most people who are force movers will benefit a little bit more, or they'll get more out of some of that fascial-based stuff, but we don't need to do a ton of it. And then equally on the opposite end, we could probably get more out of some weight room work with more elastic guys, but don't need to do too much of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I think hearing you talk through that, just intuitively, I'm like, all right, I'm a pretty fascial guy. I was running at a high level, and I would want to do that stuff because it would accentuate my strengths, obviously. But then I see someone who, one of my training partners, she spent more time on the ground. She was more of that kind of pushing-based athlete, and I would love to see her do some of that work. And we'd both probably see benefits, but for different reasons.
Right. Yeah, and I should mention too, and this is really where Matt's producing some phenomenal work for this project. He's doing a lot. He's got a lot of posts on it and been really focusing on this part where looking at the jump strategy or the force signature to kind of differentiate between these two. And the way that he just very succinctly put it together is the amount of counter movement or the amount of depth needed to produce jump height. So your fascial-driven athletes and your elastic athletes, very minimal joint displacement. Go, and they're up. For the muscle-based movers, they need a longer counter movement to recruit more of the muscle fibers to be able to produce that jump height. So that's a simple one, and we can apply that anywhere. Pogos, bounces, skips, hops, whatever. If we demand more joint displacement, we're probably going to see more muscularly driven athletes versus the ones that have zero joint displacement and just almost rocket off the ground.
Yeah, I love that. That's that'll be some really cool research to look at when you get it.
Yeah. And he's getting there. Yeah, he's doing some really great stuff. I'm very happy that we decided to do this. Yeah.
As a therapist, and we've talked the last couple of days a lot about these lines that you've identified, and you feel like it's similar to the trains that Thomas Myers talks about. Maybe not the same, but certainly the functional ones that you found have been really important. As a therapist, am I in the same way that I'm using movements as an assessment? Good?
Yeah. All good. As a therapist?
As a therapist, if I'm using these movements as an assessment and I identify either a self-reported sort of, dare I say, weakness or a disconnection or even just sort of a tightness.
Yeah.
What should my therapeutic input be? Like, am I going deep to the line that I've identified? Am I going sort of fairly superficial? And you probably can't answer this specifically, but I'm just curious as to how I can potentially apply some of these rules and these lines to the way that I work.
For sure. So, credit to a guy I actually just recently met, but has made a profound impact on me. Jason Park, guy out of LA, doing really incredible work. The way that he articulated it was the myofascial lines represent the map of the body, and it was one of those moments where I was just like, I'm worthless. Like I've been like specifically investigating this stuff for like 6, 7, 8 years now. Why didn't I think of that simplistic terminology and way of looking at it? But it does make perfect sense because again, the myofascial lines are representations or these tracks of densified collagen, right? Due to chronic or excessive loading. And there's associating musculoskeletal anatomy that runs inextricably with or along these myofascial lines. So I think that it works in two ways. Number one, I think it is a great evaluator because whether we have a recreational golfer or we have an Olympic sprinter, we can take something like the spiral line and get a lot of information from it, right? And so with the spiral line, it's a fascinating anatomy. We have an origin point essentially just below the occipital, through the neck extensors. Then we descend down through that rhomboid scapular region, and then it kind of envelops around through the serratus and the external oblique to the anterior side of the body, crossing over the midline through the internal oblique, and then descending down the leg on the anterior side through TFL, IT band. Then we track laterally on the outside of the knee through the anterior tib, crossing underneath the base of the foot through the peroneal tendon, coming back up the outside portion of the lower leg, and then wrapping posteriorly through the lateral portions of the hamstring, up through the sacrotuberous ligament, and then through the lumbosacral fascial back to the original left side. So I know that's a mouthful, but if we think about the relevant and the corresponding anatomy that is mentioned throughout that spiral line, anybody who's personal trainer, strength coach, practitioner, or otherwise should be able to extract quite a bit of information for that. So jumping back to your question, for my interest, I'll use palpation essentially throughout these tracks, and just identify points of difference. So and by difference, we can suggest tissue viscosity, we can suggest pain sensitivity, we can go in a number of different directions, but getting a general sense of what this relevant anatomy includes, what their responses are, and then basically taking them from the table to the floor, starting where we found some discrepancies or deficits. So sticking with the spiral line, let's just say we have that recreational golfer, we have a dramatic asymmetry in left-right rotation. This is where this becomes important, at least in my process or development, is I would get so myopic to, okay, we have a rotational deficit, So that has to mean that we have differences in the oblique on the left and the oblique on the right. But then you take a step back and you think about what is actually occurring when we go through any whatever rotational pattern, right? We have opposing directions of spinal action, cervical, lumbar. We have differences in adductor activity, left to right leg, depending on left to right rotation, different foot pressures that are occurring. So you can quickly start to pile these things up and go, okay, asymmetrical rotational deficit is a lot more, if nothing else, than just, okay, we need to do some oblique work. And I think for a lot of young coaches especially, it's very easy to fall in that trap. So hopefully that answered the question, but using it as a map, using it as a reference point, using it as an opportunity to find specific points within these maps or these lines to at least initiate a point of thought and then thereafter a point of action.
Because I think about that, and I think about whether it is something that the athlete's presenting with, or if I reproduced a certain level of discomfort or whatever, however you might call it, with an assessment protocol. The tendency of me, going to where it's sore, and that potentially being an inflammatory point that it is due to something else in the system. And one of the things that I learned from Altus early on from Dan and Jerry Ramajita was look where else. If there's dysfunction, don't go to the point where it's sore, go elsewhere. And I think obviously the more that you do it, the more that you explore some of these lines, and as you say, palpate them. You get better at what the difference was between, okay, this is a hot spot, this is potentially something that should be left alone, and this is like a pretty dense, wound up piece of fascia that probably needs to get some work through it.
For sure. It's the core. This is another little snippet that I'm not qualified to talk about, but the research and the work that's been done on this is actually really fascinating, where the overlapping between myofascial lines and referred pain patterns. Very, very interesting. And again, it's like there's no accidents. There's no by chance. Things are intentional. So what that kind of led me into was the concepts of stress shielding, which is another one that I think is very, very interesting and important. So stress shielding is essentially the body's way of redirecting or rerouting force exposures due to areas of weakness or of damage. So in other words, force follows stiffness. So if we have a situation where we have somebody who's coming off of a biceps tear, and we have scarring on the medial aspect of the elbow, the stiffness that develops through scar tissue formation is going to essentially create an avenue where that's where the majority of any high impact force will be transmitted through, right? So the shielding component is essentially the bypassing of that. And with the stress shielding concept most commonly refers to like hip replacements and osseous tissue, but I think it applies very similarly with the myofascial line. So we stick with the spiral line, we'll say, and tightness. Let's pull on that, right? Man, no matter what I do, my hamstrings are always tight. I can't. So I think there's 2 points of importance with that. Number one, the sensation of tightness is not suggesting that we have a chronically shortened muscle belly, and it's not necessarily the fascia is tight, right? It's a combination of proprioception, nociception, fluid dynamics, and then compression tension balance or distribution, right? So that is the easiest explanation as to why passive stretching does not resolve tightness, right? There needs to be a multimodal input to this, and then beyond that, we need to think about the constituent parts of the relevant anatomy that's in relationship to the hamstring. So we have the tightness being experienced at the biceps or the lateral hamstring group, but what about the calf, right? Because there's a continuum through that. So we need to just, again, kind of going back to the principles of the map, using these myofascial lines as reference points is highly valuable, because it can give you that next step of, okay, we've done some isolated, hamstring mobilization, whether that be on the table or on the floor. But now where do we go to next? Does this seem to be something that we should track distally? Does it seem to be something we should track proximally? Is it something that's an anterior-posterior balance? And there's no cookie-cutter answer to that. But again, being able to eliminate the trial and error process, or at least reduce it down significantly, makes us more effective at what we do, because we have more time to get to where we're trying to go.
The therapists that you've worked with that kind of more closely follow, I guess, these fascial lines, have they said that it's made them look at the body in a more simple view, or has it made things more complicated, do you think?
Ooh. Wasn't where I thought you were going with that. I've heard both.
Yeah.
And I think it is transitional. I think, both speaking for myself and for a couple of the therapists that, that I work with, regularly, have in the past, I think the concept of the myofascial anatomy makes things a little bit simpler. Because, if I had a good analogy for this, but it's almost like trying to memorize a big set of data or information one by one, and trying to always add on to what you're learning and adding more to it. Whereas with this, it's almost just like it's a more efficient summary. Where, okay, I may not be able to specifically tell you exactly where these insertional or endpoints or transition points are, but generally I got an idea. Okay, we've got force coupling above and below the knee, biceps femoris. There's going to be a relationship with the lateral gastroc, and then there's going to be another relationship with medial gastroc, and then we take that relationship and analyze the plantar aspects of the feet. So I think it's actually, I think it is a more simplistic way for especially younger coaches to just get the gist of it. Now, the opposing end of that is myofascial anatomy is largely undefined. And depending on who you talk to and what their background is, it can get very, very dense and very complex. So it's probably no different than anything else. But again, with the keeping this to the strength coach and the practitioner side of things, I think for the sake of efficiency in work and the efficiency in planning, it can be much more simplistic to understand. Yeah.
And I think also, like, I've worked with a lot of different sort of levels and types of therapists, and I think the older I've gotten, the more I've worked with the various types, I've really appreciated the very intuitive therapists. And I feel like, without thinking too much about sort of the neurology or the myotomes or anything like that, if you just sort of chase the line and just feel it through, you're kind of doing the same thing with your fascial lines, and you can sort of switch that part of your brain off and really just be there with the tissue and feel what it's doing.
So pulling on our guys again, Dan and Stu, very frequently zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out, and it was, believe it or not, those were the first people that I heard both from, right? Because I heard about, we got to zoom out, and then I've heard we got to zoom in, and like I almost do with everything else, it's like, okay, maybe we do this sometimes, and maybe we do this other times, right? So I do think that's very, very important. It is important to get lost and confused and get very granular. But then we always understand that we can just take one step back and then, all right, take a breath, let's recalibrate, and then now let's think more strategically. Taking the analytical hat off can be difficult sometimes. So intuition is where I live. And for me, it's probably because I lack a lot of the conventional understanding and some of the density of knowledge. But for me, I think that there's a feel, there's a relationship, right? There's an aura to our space, whether we're doing training or we're doing, more manual work or table work. And we should understand that. We should really try to tune into that. The other thing is that the body will tell you a lot, right? Scarring.
That's the map, yeah.
Yeah. Well, but even the response, if we're running, down the adductor group and we get to a certain point and we feel a twitch, or we see somebody start picking up their phone and, okay, so they're trying to distract themselves, so this is uncomfortable. So there may be something going on here, right? Nothing's ever an indictment. But through feel, through visual observation, through how somebody's facial expressions are, their gestures, their body language, their inclination, are they leaning in, or are they trying to drift out? Those are all things that I think can help develop intuition. Intuition isn't just some mystique thing. It's very much a skill, and I think that there's a little bit more room for that than we tend to believe. Because again, this massive push for objectifying data and show me the numbers. Yeah, great, all that's great. But what about how somebody's emotional response or how somebody's physical response to training or treatment is? What is their emotional capacity? Because as you know better than I do, sometimes it can get emotional on the table and in the treatment room. I don't know if that's something we'll work into this conversation or not, but that's another aptitude of fascia, right? So the interoceptive component, the proprioception and nociceptive responses, and then just the general physiology that is occurring, I think tells us quite a bit.
Zooming out.
Zoom out.
What do you see as like the future of I guess fascial training, and maybe what do you think it might be? Where would you like things to go?
I hope this is the question I think you're asking. I think that the evidence of training is widely variable. I'm a football guy, so apologies to this crowd, but Bo Jackson, Herschel Walker, and Deion Sanders were notorious for never going to the weight room. Not for them. They were going to show up and they were going to fight. Bo Jackson, Herschel Walker ran hills, push-ups, pull-ups, bodyweight squats, calisthenics. Tom Brady, very famously, had a stark transition in how he approached his training and his body about halfway through his career to basically go into kind of like a modified Pilates. And then we've seen athletes squatting 700 pounds, running backs, doing tire drags uphill and all these different nuanced technologies, and all of it has shown to work and not work. So because of my introduction and because of my shortcomings and failures early on, I had a little bit of an alchemist way of being introduced to this, and that's why I'm so appreciative of the people in this field, because that's what taught me. YouTube and Twitter taught me my foundations for this, and then I doubled back to the classroom. All of that is to say, it's a blank canvas. I think we've been poorly conditioned into thinking that we have to do X, Y, and Z, otherwise we're not worth a damn, or we're doing it wrong. I think there is tremendous room for interpretation on most things. There's a left and right flank. We reasonably agree on some majority of this, but I think there's way more that is left untapped. Moving forward, as with all things performance training, something more important needs to happen in order for us to see benefit or value from that. Chiropractics wouldn't be considered a part of the sports performance model if people didn't have, scoliosis and spinal fractures and compressions and need to be able to walk and go to work again. We saw what they were doing for general population people because there was a legitimacy or a logistic demand for people being healthy enough to go to work. So then all of a sudden, now we take that and we intersperse that into the high performance model. In a sense, fascial-based training could potentially follow a similar track, and I think, totally random here, but I think that robotics is going to be a big tipping point for fascial-based training, and the reason for that is that with all of the development and the frightening evolution of robotics that we are currently witnessing and experiencing, they still move like robots. So what I believe there's going to be more emphasis on is they are going to investigate and study biological fascial tissue to help accelerate robotics by truly humanizing movement. And I think that's really what fascia does. I think that's what gives us coordination and continuity throughout the body that allows us to move as humans move. With all of thinking about all of the math and physics and mechanics that goes into Boston University to develop these robots, it's astronomical. Still can't get them to move like humans, right? So my hope, I suppose, is that because of this pressing demand from billionaires to develop robots, we're going to have to investigate fascia more legitimately than we have, and I think that's going to tell us a lot more about what it does. The other area that I'll slip in there as well, and this is not an original thought of mine, this is something that is kind of circulating at the moment, I think there's going to be a lot of unraveling, we'll say, or unveiling through cancer research. And I think that there's going to be some significant findings from that as well, to see to what extent the fascial tissue or fascial system plays in the evolution and progression of cancer.
All right, over here. Thanks so much, man. I can't wait for your course.
I appreciate you, brother. Thank you.
Good job, fellas. Nice work.
It's just getting warm.
What do we get? We got I don't know how long. How does it say?
Yeah,
I don't even know how to press stop.